Hello friends, my name's Ty and I'm going to read to you. Today's selection is a story called The Butcher's Bill. Now this is set in London, England, but I am not going to insult anyone by trying to fake an English accent through the reading of the story. So suspend your disbelief and let your imagination go. Here we go. Constable Thomas Williams took his helmet off and squatted down beside the boy's body. It didn't matter how many times he'd seen death. It never seemed to get any easier. "How old do you think the poor little bastard is?" his partner, Bert Shaw, asked as he leaned over him, holding his lantern up. Thomas pulled back the collar of the boy's threadbare coat to see his face, as well as a deep purple bruise on his neck. "Can't be more than 12 or 13. "What's he doing down here?" Bert asked. Standing, Thomas rubbed his chin and looked around. They were in a narrow alley behind a row of homes that faced the Grosvenor Park, a neighborhood occupied by people of influence. This boy was as out of place as a rat swimming in a punch bowl. Thomas placed his helmet back on his head. "I think the more important question is, why is he dead?" "You sent for a detective?" Bert asked. "I did," Thomas said. "Young Davy Hale should be back here with him any minute." As if on cue, rapid footfalls echoed off the well-kept homes on either side of the footpath. Constable Davy Hale, still puffing from his run up to the Hyde Park station, held up a lantern for a tall, thin man dressed in a long coat and bowler hat. Thomas recognized him as a detective named James Horgan. "Oh, thank Christ," the tall detective said when he got close enough to see the body. Thomas exchanged a glance with Bert. "Begging your pardon, detective," Thomas said, "but I'm not sure what it is we're to be thankful for." "I thought it was another one," Horgan said. "Another one?" Bert asked. "Another of the Ripper's leavings." "We're a long way from Whitechapel," young Davy squeaked. The detective cuffed him up the back of the head, knocking his helmet off. Davy caught it, plunked it back on his head with a silent flourish. He was used to being cuffed. "I know we're off from Whitechapel," Horgan said. "And I was worried I'd be flogged for letting the Ripper kill someone in Hyde Park." "Right," Thomas said. "So what's to do about the boy, then?" "What boy?" Horgan asked. Thomas ground his teeth while he came to the conclusion that only those who were mentally unsound were ever promoted to detective. "The dead boy that Bert is currently shining his lantern upon." "Oh, him." Horgan did up another button against the morning's damp chill. "Clean him up." "Detective?" Thomas asked. "What, are you addled? Get rid of the bloody body before anyone sees it and it causes a panic." "Aren't you going to investigate this boy's murder?" Bert asked, his voice pitching up like it always did when he got angry. "Murder?" Horgan huffed. "He probably died of consumption." "I've got my doubts, detective," Thomas said, crouching down beside the body. "That a boy this young would have died of consumption, and," he pulled back the collar of the boy's coat, "the bruises on his neck would suggest a different cause of death. With the Ripper murders consuming the lives of every detective in the city, I've scarcely got time to be fooling around with boys who are where they should not be." He turned on his heel and walked briskly the way he'd come. "Clean this up, Constable. That's an order." "What was he doing when you found him?" Thomas asked young Davy, once Horgan was out of earshot. "Sleeping with his feet on his desk," Davy said, giving his nose a wipe. "Lazy bastard," Bert said. He turned towards Thomas. "What do we do then?" Chewing his cheek, Thomas stared down the alley where the detective had gone. "We do like he says, and clean it up." He turned to young Davy and put his hand on the lad's shoulder. "Can you go and find a wagon and take this boy to the morgue?" "I can," the younger man said. "Good lad. Bert, you stay with the body, then go with Davy to the morgue. Do you know Dr. Simmons?" Bert nodded. "The doctor you served with in Burma?" "The very same." "Tell him I'm calling in a favor, and ask him to examine the body." "Okay, Tommy," Bert said. "What will you be doing?" Thomas pulled out the notebook from the breast pocket of his long coat, along with a pencil. He opened the book to the first blank page and began walking around the body, sketching what he saw. "I," he said, "am going to try and discover who murdered this child." There was one thing Constable Thomas Williams had learned in the half-dozen years he'd walked the streets of London. It was wealth did not equal cooperation. There was a lot of talk among the city's upper echelons about civic duty and pride in community, but when it came right down to it, people didn't care what happened to anyone else as long as it didn't affect them. The people of Hyde Park didn't care what the residents of Whitechapel spent most of their lives doing in their own filth, so long as they stayed in Whitechapel. The only reason anyone gave a care about the Ripper murders was that it was popular to do so, and the only reason the force was working so hard to catch old Jack was the fear he might stop chopping up Whitechapel girls and go after their more distinguished fare. Thomas canvassed the homes that ringed the location of the boy's body, and 300 paces in either direction. Each door he knocked on was answered by a footman or butler, who all scolded him for the untimely hour of his visit and flatly refused to allow him to speak to the master of the house. More often than not, when he told them he was investigating a murder of an unidentified boy, they scoffed and closed the door in his face. He came to the last house in the corner of Mount and Queen Street, and though he was footsore and well past his time, he mounted the steps to the imposing house and rang the bell. He waited long moments before he heard the bolt being thrown and saw a stoop-shouldered old butler. Unlike the other men or maids he'd seen that morning, this man was not freshly pressed or combed. Strands of his gray hair had come loose of his pomade, and his black coat was quite rumpled. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his skin had the pale cast of the truly exhausted. "Yes?" the old man asked, looking Thomas up and down. "I'm Constable Williams, sir, and I'm hoping you can help me." "If I can, I will." The old butler's manner was stiff, but he hadn't shut the door in Thomas's face yet. "We've discovered the body of a boy, a short distance from here, and I'm wondering if you've noticed anything strange last night." The butler was silent for the space of a long breath. "Foul play is suspected?" "It is, sir." "Please come in, Constable." The man stepped back and held the door open. Thomas stood there for several moments until he realized his mouth was hanging open. He closed it with a click, stepped through the door, and doffed his helmet to tuck on beneath his arm. "This way, please," the butler said, and led Thomas through a wide foyer into an expansive sitting room. The room was at least twice as big as the narrow house Thomas shared with his wife, and any one of the numerous pieces of furniture was likely worth as much as he made in a year. The butler continued with a steady stride to the back of the room, where a fire was crackling in a white stone hearth. On a sofa, facing the fire, was a man about a dozen years older than Thomas was 30. He was wearing a heavy black overcoat, the collar of which one hand was continually pulling at, while the other hand held a mostly empty brandy snifter. "Constable Williams," the butler said. "This is Edgar Wright, the master of the house. Sir, this is Constable Williams." The man stood immediately, his expression changing quickly from bewildered to furious while his ruddy face turned a darker shade of red beneath his white sideburns. "And what is he doing in my house?" The butler's mild expression didn't change. "He's a constable of the watch, and asked to speak to the master of the house. It was my duty to bring him to you." Keeping his face carefully neutral, Thomas regarded the butler a moment. He had not said that. Not exactly. "Well," Wright said, draining the dregs of his glass and sitting on a side table with a dull plunk. "Now that you are in my house, Constable, what do you want?" He shrugged out of his long coat and threw it at the butler. The old man draped it over his arm and turned to walk stiffly from the room. "We've discovered a body," Thomas said. "A boy, not more than 13, not far from here." He watched Wright carefully while he asked the question. The man was losing his scarlet hue, and Thomas saw that his eyes bore the same dark circles as the butler's. "And what has a dead boy to do with me?" Wright asked. "Just inquiring if you'd seen him, sir," Thomas said. "Or if you'd seen anyone with him. Or how would I have seen a boy from the inside of my house?" "I imagine you'd been out recently, sir, as you're wearing your coat until a moment ago, and still wear your scarf." Wright's hand shot up to the scarf at his neck, the fingers hooking into the fabric as though to pull it off. He paused and then patted it back into place. "I was out until recently, it is true, as I had an urgent matter to attend to." He touched the scarf again. "Due to the late hour and the weather, I've taken a chill, and I will wear a scarf until the brandy warms me." "Very good, sir," Thomas said, as agreeably as he could manage. "Did you see a boy, then? About this tall?" He held out his hand a little lower than the center of his chest, the height he believed the boy to be had he been standing. "Wearing a worn-out red coat?" "I did not," Wright said, his tone flat. "I know nothing of any boy." He cleared his throat noisily and looked at the clock on the hearth above the fire. "Now, if you'll be kind enough to see yourself to the door, I must retire and get some rest before the business of the day begins." "Of course, sir," Thomas said, placing his helmet back on his head. "Thank you for seeing me." Wright gave no response, but turned and faced the fire. Thomas did as he was asked and walked himself back to the door. The old butler was there and opened the door for Thomas as he got close. "Was your query successful, Constable?" the old man asked. "I've not made a decision on that just yet." "Very good, then," the butler said. "I hope to see you again. Soon." Thomas paused on the threshold and studied the old man's face. It was completely flat, not a twitch or emotion betrayed. Thomas touched the brim of his helmet and stepped through the door. "Perhaps you will." "Poor little bastard," Dr. Leo Simmons said as he bent his considerable bulk over the table and scribbled another note on a sheet of paper already cammed with his careful handwriting. "That he is," Thomas said, nodding his agreement. They were in a small room in the back of the morgue, next to the Hyde Park Police Headquarters, and the boy lay on a table between them. He'd not looked very big, lying in the wet alley, but he was little more than a ghost lying naked on the wooden table. His skin was pale, shining almost transparent in the grey daylight slanting in from the windows set high in the wall, and every bone stood out in stark relief. "What can you tell me, Leo?" Thomas asked, trying to look away from the purple bruises on the boy's neck, but finding his gaze drawn inexorably back. "I can tell you're mad for bringing this boy here under Horgan's nose. The man is a right vindictive shit, and he'll make your life miserable." In all the years of their long friendship, since their days in the Burma conflict, Thomas could always count on Leo for the stark truth, regardless of whether he wanted it or not. "I mean, what can you tell me about the boy?" Leo stood upright, tugging at his short beard with thumb and forefinger. "Well," he said, glancing down at his notes, "the cause of death, obviously, is strangulation. His throat is completely crushed. But he had some other strange injuries as well." "What sort?" Thomas asked. "Look here," Leo said, pointing at the boy's midsection. "There are obvious ligature marks here, around his waistline." Thomas bent close and saw where Leo was pointing. A line of broken blood vessels ringed the boy's waist. "Where do you imagine he got those?" Leo turned to a small table behind him, where the boy's clothes were heaped, and picked up a cracked leather belt. He laid it against the boy's pale skin, and it covered a purple marks almost exactly. "Someone is trying to yank his trousers off," Thomas said. "Aye, and trying damned hard, too." Leo set down the belt and picked up one of the boy's stiff hands. His fingertips are all raw as they were trying to hold on to his clothing. "I'll be buggered," Thomas said. "That was probably the intended purpose for this lad," Leo said. "And I'd say whoever strangled him did so because they got tired of his fighting." "Is there anything else?" "Indeed there is," Leo said. He picked up a small metal dish from the table behind him and held it out to Thomas. Inside was a brass button, a relief of a stag's head on the surface. "Where did you get this?" Thomas asked, plucking the button from the dish. "From inside his throat," Leo said. There were small chips in his front teeth as though he was trying to bite something that was too hard. He looked down at the boy. "Like I said, he was fighting." Thomas nodded and slipped the button into his pocket. "That he was, and I'm willing to bet, should I find the owner of the coat with this missing button, I'll find the man who killed this boy." "That you will," Leo said and extended his hand. Thomas shook it. "Thanks, Leo," Thomas said. "I am in your debt." "No," Leo said, releasing Thomas's hand. "Now I am out of yours." Thomas put his helmet on and turned to go, but stopped when Leo cleared his throat. "You know, one day we're going to have to talk about it," Leo said. "We'll have to talk about Burma." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "But not today." When he walked through the door into the hallway of the Hyde Park headquarters, Thomas was thinking of going home and getting some sleep. Those thoughts were quickly set aside when young Davy, looking just as tired as Thomas felt, found him. "There's a woman at the sergeant's desk," young Davy said. "She's from Old Nickel and is looking for her son, 12 years old." The boy certainly looked like he lived in the slums. "Right," Thomas said, doffing his helmet to hurry down the hall towards the sergeant's desk. The desk sergeant was a big man, with a curling mustache that was on its way towards being white. He was standing, his fists planted on either side of the desk, glowering down at a scrawny woman in a tattered coat and muddy shoes. "I am quite sure," the sergeant said in his booming voice, "that we have no information about your son. Now remove yourself from this building, or I will have you removed." Several uniformed constables had stopped to watch this exchange. The scrawny woman shoved a hank of greasy hair from behind her ear, and her eyes flicked to either side of her nervously. But she gave no indication that she was about to move. "I tell you he is a runner," she said, her voice climbing into a pitched panic. "I talked to the man he works for, and he said he had to deliver a package to a house in Grosvenor Square. He's a good boy and always comes home at night. You've got to look for him." The sergeant flicked his thick hand at two constables. "Show this woman out." "Wait," Thomas said, skidding to a stop in front of the desk. The woman cringed away from him, but he held out a placating hand. "Tell me, what did your boy look like?" She glanced up at the desk sergeant and looked back at Thomas. "He was about this high." She held up a hand to the level of Thomas's chest. "His hair and eyes are brown, like his father's," she sniffed, "and he was wearing a red coat." Thomas pulled in a deep breath. "Please, come with me. I have something I need to show you." Once she had identified the body of her son, Jonathan Smith, 12 years old, Thomas knelt and held Elizabeth Smith's hand while she cried. "He was all that I had since his dad died," she said between sobs. "And he was a good boy. Worked harder than a boy his age should have." "Do you know which house he was bound for?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "The man who pays him to run errands in the evening gave Jonathan a package. Letters, he said, and the address was marked on the front of them. He doesn't remember where they were going, except if it were a house in Grosvenor Square." Thomas nodded. He had an idea which house it might be. "Do you know who the messages were from?" "From a captain in the harbour. Shipping records, or so my boy's employer said." He nodded again. He had an idea about that too. "So what's to happen now?" Elizabeth asked, wiping her nose with the handkerchief that Thomas had given her when he showed her Jonathan's body. "Are we going to find whoever killed my boy, or will he just be another mark on the butcher's bill?" Making promises in a situation like this was unwise, but the look in Elizabeth's pale eyes was too much for Thomas to refuse. "No, Mrs. Smith, I intend to see that this particular bill is paid." After several inquiries with the clerk in the archives room, Thomas had formed a plan. He had almost made it to the chief inspector's office when he was intercepted by Detective James Horgan. "Constable Williams," Horgan said, pointing his finger at Thomas's chest, "take yourself to the chief inspector's office this instant." "I plan on doing just that," Thomas replied, not slowing as he walked around Horgan and his finger. He heard the tall man give an indignant squawk and hurried to catch up to him. "You've a great deal to answer for, Constable," Horgan said, puffing as he caught up to Thomas. "We've had a complaint from Edgar Wright of a constable haranguing him at break of day about a dead boy." "I believe haranguing is a strong word, Detective," Thomas said. "But there will be some answering done, I'm quite certain." The door to the chief inspector's office was open, and the man himself sat behind his wide desk. He was a broad man, with thick hands and shoulders suited to a dock worker, and it was said that he wrung many a confession from London criminals during his days as a detective. He looked up at the sound of Thomas and Horgan's matching steps. "Constable Williams, I see Detective Horgan has found you. Come in." Thomas removed his helmet and stood in front of the chief inspector's desk, his heels together. Horgan took up a position to Thomas's left, his hands on his hips. The chief inspector put down the pen he'd been using. "You understand that we've had a complaint from a prominent Hyde Park citizen?" the chief inspector asked. "I do, sir," Thomas said. "Can you tell me what the complaint might be about?" "Constable Shaw and I discovered the body of a boy near Grosvenor Square, sir," Thomas said. "We've since identified him as Jonathan Smith, 12 years old. There were signs of foul play, and I was making inquiries with nearby households." "If you suspected foul play, why did you not summon a detective?" "We did, sir," Thomas said. The chief inspector sat back in his chair, his gaze leaving Thomas and landing on Horgan. "And which detective did you speak to?" "Detective Horgan, sir." "That is a fact Detective Horgan failed to disclose to me," the chief inspector said. Thomas could feel the detective's discomfiture radiating off him like heat off a stove. "What did Detective Horgan tell you to do, Constable?" "I didn't want to cause a panic, sir," Horgan said, speaking rapidly. "I felt that discretion was needed before anyone saw the body and associated it to the Whitechapel murders." The chief inspector raised one thick hand, and Horgan stopped speaking immediately. "Answer my question, please, Constable." "We were directed to clean up the body, sir," Thomas said. "So you did nothing, Horgan?" There was a murdered child in our district, and you did nothing. Horgan opened his mouth again, but the chief inspector cut him off. No, that was not a question. I know you did nothing. The chief inspector sighed like a disappointed father and looked back at Thomas. Tell me, Constable, what do you know so far? I asked a doctor at the morgue to examine the body, Thomas said. He concluded the boy was strangled, and it looks as though someone had forcibly tried to remove his clothing, specifically his trousers. The chief inspector said nothing, and Thomas took that as encouragement to continue. The boy's fingers were raw, as though he had been fighting, and he also had several chips in his front teeth, most likely from biting something hard. This, Thomas pulled the button from his pocket and placed it on the chief inspector's desk, was found in his throat. The chief inspector picked up the button and examined it. So, someone tried to bugger this child and killed him when he fought back. That is my belief, sir. What do you think we should do next? I would request that you issue me a writ of entry, Thomas said. For what place? The chief inspector asked. For Edgar Wright's residence. Detective Horgan made a choking sound, and Thomas saw the chief inspector frown. What do you hope to accomplish from that? I've spoken to the boy's mother, Thomas said. He was employed as a messenger, and the last job he was given was to deliver a parcel of letters, likely shipping manifests from the harbor. I checked with our archives, and Edgar Wright has interests in several shipping companies. I believe that inside Edgar Wright's house I will find shipping records containing yesterday's date, as well as a coat missing a button. The chief inspector drummed his fingers on his desk for several long moments. Then he opened his desk, took out a blank writ, and filled out Edgar Wright's address. After signing it, he held it out to Thomas. You understand that if you are wrong about this, I won't be able to secure your position, and you will be asked to resign, the chief inspector said. I do understand, sir, Thomas said, accepting the writ. Chief Inspector, Detective Horgan said, I really must object. This is preposterous. The chief inspector looked over at Horgan. I hope that you understand, Detective, that if Constable Williams is correct, that I am going to promote him to the position you currently occupy, and you will be demoted and reassigned. I'm thinking that some time in Old Nickel will teach you a little compassion and accountability. He turned back to Thomas. Report back to me as soon as your investigation is concluded. Thomas saluted and stepped briskly to find Bert and young Davy. The old butler answered the door only moments after Thomas rang the bell. The old man looked no less haggard, but smiled when he saw Thomas, Bert, and Davy. Good day, Constable Williams. I am glad to see you again. I doubt your master will be as glad, Thomas said, holding up the writ. I've come with a writ of entry, signed by our chief inspector. The old man nodded and stepped back from the door. Please come in and see your duty done. Butler led them from the front door to a dining room off the main foyer. Edgar Wright was seated, facing them, eating eggs off toast while he read from a sheaf of papers at his elbow, his mouth open in an O of surprise when he saw them. You again, he said, putting down his fork. I thought you'd be stripped of that uniform by now. What do you want? I wish to see the coat you were wearing this morning, Thomas said. I believe it is missing a button. He pulled the button from his pocket and slapped it on the polished surface of the table. We pulled that from the throat of the boy you tried to bugger and then murdered. Wright snorted and sipped from his teacup. I'm afraid I grew quite tired of that coat and ordered it burned, so it won't be available for examination. You mean this coat? Thomas turned to see the butler walking slowly into the room, a black overcoat draped across his arm. Thomas glanced back at Wright and saw that the man's face was growing pale. I must apologize, sir, the old man said, but I didn't quite get to the task of burning this coat. Bert took the coat off the old man's arm. The buttons are the same, and there is one missing from the collar. Thomas plucked the button off the table and put it back in his pocket. I also suspect, Mr. Wright, that the documents you are currently reading are shipping manifests. When I checked with the man who sent them to you, I believe he would tell me that he hired a messenger service, the same one your victim worked for, to courier these manifests to you. I am also willing to wager that those marks on your neck, Thomas pointed to a peculiar bruise he could see on Wright's neck, now that he wasn't wearing a scarf, will bear a striking resemblance to the boy's teeth. Wright cleared his throat, and failed at putting on an air of nonchalance. And what do you think this all means? Thomas reached beneath his coat and removed his baton. He laid it, ever so softly, on Wright's collarbone. "It means you hang with the rest of the filth." Wright let out a startled cry when Thomas seized him by the front of his shirt and hauled him to his feet, shoving him towards Bert. He and young Davy dragged Wright, sobbing, towards the front door. Thomas gathered up the shipping manifests and the coat Bert had dropped, and turned to follow. The old man was standing at the entrance to the dining room. "Thank you," the old man said. "Did you know?" Thomas asked. "I suspected," the butler said. "There have been other boys, plied with wine and sent away in tears and shame. I never saw for myself, but I guessed what that bastard was doing," the old man sighed. "Last night I saw the boy into the house, and when I heard sounds of fighting from Wright's office. Then nothing. Then the hour before dawn he appeared in the parlor. He was wet, his coat was missing a button, and he was shouting for brandy. I didn't know what he'd done with the boy until you knocked on the door." Thomas nodded. "And you knew I would be back?" The old man shrugged. "I hoped." "Will you come to the headquarters and tell that story to the chief inspector?" The old man nodded. "Thank you." Thomas turned to go, but the old man stopped him with a hand on his arm. "What's going to happen to him?" "To Wright?" Thomas asked. "A week from now, he'll be nothing more than another name on the butcher's bill." The end. Thank you, friends. I hope you liked it.